If oppression continues unchecked, it leads to the final stage, capture. This is not about control in an obvious sense. It is about direction. At this point, your life begins to move without clear alignment to truth. Decisions are shaped more by emotion than by conviction. You are still living, still choosing, but something deeper is no longer guiding you. Jesus said in John 10 verse 10 that the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but he came to bring life. Capture is where that contrast becomes visible, not through sudden collapse, but through gradual loss of clarity, purpose, and spiritual sensitivity. You may no longer question what is happening, not because everything is clear, but because awareness has faded. What once felt wrong now feels normal. What once required discernment now feels automatic. This is the danger. Not intensity, but silence. Not resistance, but drift. But even here, the door is not closed. The response is immediate realignment. Return to what anchors you. Prayer, even if it feels unfamiliar. Scripture, even if it feels distant. Surrender, even if it feels difficult. Because direction can be restored the moment alignment is restored. And recognizing this stage changes everything that comes next. Everything changes the moment you recognize the pattern. Up to this point, each stage builds on the last. Distraction leads to deception. Deception leads to confusion. And step by step, clarity fades. But recognition interrupts that process. It breaks the sequence. Jesus makes this clear in Luke 10 verse 19. Authority has been given over all the power of the enemy. That authority is not based on emotion. It is based on alignment with Him. Many believers feel powerless not because they lack authority, but because they lack awareness. They are reacting to symptoms without understanding the source. And when the source is hidden, the response becomes ineffective. But now you can see it. You can identify where you are. You can recognize the stage. And once you do that, you are no longer passive. You move from reaction to intention. Authority begins with clarity. The moment you stop agreeing with what is false and return to what is true, something shifts. Not externally at first, but internally. Your thinking realigns. Your perception sharpens. And when your perception changes, your direction begins to change with it. Most battles are not lost because of weakness. They are lost because they are not recognized. Hosea 4 verse 6 says that people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, not lack of effort, not lack of desire, lack of understanding. When you cannot see what is happening, you cannot respond to it correctly. But now you can see the pattern. What once felt random may no longer be random. The pressure, the confusion, the distance, it can now be understood. And when something is understood, it loses its power to control you unnoticed. This is where everything becomes personal. Where are you in this process right now? Not where you wish you were, but where you truly are. Awareness requires honesty, because once you identify the stage, you also identify the response. You're no longer reacting blindly. You're responding with clarity, and clarity changes direction. From this point forward, you do not move based only on what you feel. You move based on what is true. And that shift, quiet, intentional, steady, is where real spiritual strength begins. If America is not in the Bible, why does it feel like everything happening right now is pointing somewhere prophetic? This question keeps surfacing, quietly but persistently. You hear it in conversations, you see it in videos, you feel it when global events begin to mirror something deeper than politics or history. And maybe you've asked yourself more than once, is this just coincidence, or is there something I'm missing? Because the tension is real. On one side, there are voices confidently claiming that America must be part of biblical prophecy. On the other, there is Scripture itself, which never clearly names it. And somewhere in between, you're left trying to reconcile what you hear with what is actually written. Ecclesiastes reminds us that there is nothing new under the sun. Patterns repeat. Empires rise and fall. But that truth comes with a warning. Repetition does not equal revelation. Just because something feels familiar or even significant does not mean we are interpreting it correctly. And that is where many people get lost. It is not wrong to ask questions. In fact, the desire to understand is part of a sincere faith. But there is a difference between seeking truth and rushing to conclusions. The danger is not curiosity. The danger is certainty without foundation. Because once an idea feels convincing enough, it becomes easy to stop searching. And when that happens, we may hold on to explanations that sound spiritual, but are not rooted in what God actually revealed. So the real issue is not whether this question exists. It is why it feels so urgent now, and what is driving so many people to search for answers in the first place. That is exactly where we need to go next. There is a reason this idea feels so convincing. When people look at the United States, they see influence on a global scale. Economic power, cultural reach, military strength. A nation that shapes conversations across the world. And when they open the Bible and read about powerful kingdoms, dominant systems, and end-time events, the connection feels almost automatic. It seems to fit. Some point to the imagery in Revelation, especially chapters 17 and 18, where a great power described as Babylon rises with wealth, influence, and moral corruption. Others interpret symbols in Daniel, trying to map ancient visions onto modern realities. And in that process, America often becomes the center of the theory. But here is where careful attention matters. Revelation was written in a symbolic language, full of imagery that carried meaning for its original audience. Babylon itself was not just a location. It represented rebellion against God, a system built on pride, excess, and spiritual blindness. It was both historical and prophetic, but never meant to be reduced to a single modern nation without clear biblical grounding. The problem is not that people are trying to understand prophecy. The problem is when interpretation begins with assumptions instead of scripture. It is easy to look at power and assume identity, to see influence and assign meaning. But the Bible does not ask us to guess. It invites us to discern. And discernment requires something difficult, the willingness to step back and admit that not everything that looks connected actually is. Because if we build our understanding on what seems obvious, instead of what is clearly revealed, we risk creating answers that feel right, but lead us away from truth. Which brings us to something even more unsettling. What happens when the Bible is completely silent about the question we are trying so hard to answer? At some point, every honest search leads to the same realization. The Bible never clearly names America. This is not a hidden detail or a mistranslation. It is simply not there. Scripture speaks about nations, kingdoms, and empires, especially in books like Daniel and Revelation. But these descriptions are often symbolic, representing systems of power rather than modern political maps. Daniel saw visions of rising and falling kingdoms, each with influence over the earth. Revelation describes global systems that shape human behavior and oppose God. Yet in all of this, there is no direct reference that can be confidently identified as the United States. And that silence can feel uncomfortable, because we expect something so significant in today's world to appear somewhere in the biblical narrative. We assume that if a nation holds this much influence, it must have a defined role in prophecy. But Scripture does not always confirm our expectations. In fact, sometimes it redirects them. The absence of a clear mention forces a deeper question. What if the focus of prophecy was never meant to be tied to modern national identities in the way we imagine? This does not mean that current events are irrelevant. It means they are not the foundation of truth. The foundation has already been given, and it does not depend on us assigning names to symbols that were never explicitly defined. Faith, in this context, requires humility. It requires accepting that not every question will be answered in the way we expect. And more importantly, that certainty does not come from filling in the gaps, but from trusting what has already been revealed. So instead of forcing Scripture to speak where it is silent, the better approach is to listen more carefully to what it actually emphasizes. Because what the Bible chooses to highlight about the end times may be very different from what we have been searching for. When Jesus spoke about the end times, he did not point to a specific nation and say, "Watch this one." Instead, he pointed to something far more personal and far more dangerous. In Matthew 24, he warned about deception, false prophets, confusion, and a gradual drifting away from truth. He spoke about hearts growing cold, about people being misled, about a world where it becomes harder to recognize what is real and what is not. Notice what is missing. There is no instruction to identify modern countries, no command to decode political systems, no emphasis on mapping prophecy onto geography. The focus is entirely spiritual. See that no one leads you astray. That is where Jesus begins. Because the greatest threat in the last days is not misunderstanding a nation. It is losing clarity about truth itself. And this shifts everything. It means the question is no longer, where is America in prophecy? But am I able to discern what is true when everything around me becomes confusing? The warnings are not distant. They are immediate. They apply to the condition of the heart, the strength of faith, the ability to remain grounded when voices compete for attention. This is why so many people feel unsettled right now. Not just because of events, but because of the uncertainty surrounding them. It is not just about what is happening. It is about not knowing how to interpret it. And Jesus already anticipated that. He did not call his followers to predict every detail. He called them to remain awake, steady, and rooted in him, no matter how unclear the world becomes. Which leads to a question that is far more uncomfortable than anything we have asked so far. What if the real question was never about America at all? It is easy to focus on nations, systems, and global movements. These things feel large, important, and urgent. But Jesus consistently redirected attention away from external speculation and toward internal reality. In Luke 18, verse 8, he asks a question that cuts deeper than any theory. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? Not recognition, not correct predictions, faith. This changes the weight of everything, because it means you can spend years trying to identify how prophecy unfolds and still miss the condition that actually matters. You can follow every discussion, analyze every event, and still remain spiritually unprepared. And that is the quiet danger. The mind feels engaged, but the heart remains unchanged. There is something within us that wants clarity about the future. It gives a sense of control, a feeling that we understand what is coming. But Scripture never presents knowledge as the ultimate goal. It presents readiness. And readiness is not built through speculation. It is built through alignment with truth. So instead of asking, "Where does my nation fit into prophecy?" the more urgent question becomes, if everything were to unfold right now, would my faith be real or just informed? That question does not allow distance. It does not stay theoretical. It moves directly into your life, your choices, your priorities. And once you begin to see that, something shifts. Because the focus is no longer out there. It is here. And that is where the warnings begin to feel personal. The warnings in Scripture are not abstract. They are patterns you can recognize, not just in the world, but in yourself. Paul writes in 2 Timothy 4 verse 3 that a time will come when people will not endure sound teaching, but will gather voices that tell them what they want to hear. That moment is not defined by geography. It is defined by preference. Truth becomes optional. Conviction becomes uncomfortable. And slowly, without noticing, faith begins to adjust itself to fit desire instead of aligning with God. This is one of the clearest signs. Not chaos in the streets, but compromise in the heart. Another warning is distraction. Life becomes full, fast, and constantly demanding attention. And in that noise, what truly matters is pushed to the edges. Not rejected, just postponed. And what is postponed long enough eventually fades. Jesus warned about this as well. Not everyone who drifts away does so intentionally. Some are simply overwhelmed, gradually losing focus without realizing what is happening. Then there is the subtle shift in how truth is viewed. Instead of something fixed, it becomes something interpreted, reshaped, personalized. But truth that bends to preference is no longer truth. These are not distant signs. They are present realities. And this is where many misunderstand the nature of biblical warnings. They are not meant to create fear about the future. They are meant to reveal the present condition of the heart. Because long before anything changes globally, something begins changing internally. And if that goes unnoticed, everything else becomes easier to misinterpret, which leads to another assumption that quietly shapes how people see their place in all of this. There is a quiet assumption many people carry without realizing it. If everything around me feels stable, then I must be safe. It is not always spoken, but it shapes how people think. A strong nation, functioning systems, access to resources, these things create a sense of protection. And over time, that external stability begins to feel like internal security. But Scripture challenges that idea directly. In 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 3, it says, "While people are saying, 'Peace and safety,' then sudden destruction will come upon them." The warning is not about the absence of peace. It is about trusting in it as if it were permanent. Because external conditions can change quickly, and when faith is tied to environment, it becomes fragile. This is where the illusion forms, not in obvious fear, but in quiet confidence. The belief that because life appears stable, nothing urgent needs to be addressed. That preparation can wait. That spiritual clarity is already in place. But true security was never meant to come from systems or surroundings. It comes from being rooted in something unshakable. And that is why this matters. Because if your sense of stability is built on what you see around you, then any disruption will feel like everything is falling apart. But if it is built on truth, then even uncertainty will not move you. This is not about rejecting the world you live in. It is about understanding its limits. Nations rise. Nations change. History moves forward. But none of those things were ever meant to carry the weight of your faith. And once that becomes clear, another perspective begins to open. What if the question itself has been pointing in the wrong direction? Not because it is meaningless, but because it centers something that was never meant to be central. From the beginning, God's plan was never limited to one nation, one culture, or one moment in history. Revelation 7 verse 9 describes a multitude from every nation, tribe, people, and language standing before him. The vision is not narrow. It is global. It is eternal. And that changes the frame. Because if God's focus is not on elevating a single modern nation within prophecy, then the search for that identity may be distracting from something greater. Something that includes but does not revolve around where you live. This is where many people begin to feel a shift. The need to assign meaning to a country starts to lose its urgency. Not because the world does not matter, but because it is no longer the center of the story. The center has always been God's kingdom, unfolding across time, reaching people everywhere. And in that perspective, your role becomes clearer. You are not part of this because of your nationality. You are part of this because of your relationship with Him. That distinction removes confusion. It breaks the need to define your place through external identity and replaces it with something deeper, something unchanging. And once you see that, the question is no longer about where your nation stands. It becomes about where you stand within something far greater, which leads directly into the role that cannot be ignored. Once the focus shifts away from nations, something else becomes unavoidable. Your role. Jesus said in Matthew 5 verse 14, "You are the light of the world." Not a nation, not a system. You. This is where everything becomes personal again. Because while many are trying to interpret global events, Scripture keeps bringing the attention back to individual faithfulness. Not in isolation from the world, but as a response within it. To be light means clarity in confusion. It means holding to truth when it becomes unpopular. It means living in a way that reflects something steady, even when everything else feels unstable. And that kind of life does not come from having all the answers about the future. It comes from being grounded in what does not change. There is a difference between reacting to what is happening and being prepared for whatever happens. One depends on constant updates. The other depends on a consistent foundation. This is why Scripture emphasizes endurance, not prediction. Because endurance reveals what is real. Anyone can feel confident when things are clear. But when uncertainty grows, when questions remain unanswered, when the future is not fully understood, that is when faith is tested. And in that moment, what matters is not how much you have figured out, but how firmly you are anchored. So instead of trying to stand on shifting interpretations, the invitation is to stand on something solid, something that does not move with circumstances or depend on external clarity. And that brings us to the answer you have been waiting for. So, is America in the Bible? The honest answer is this: Scripture does not clearly identify it. There is no direct reference that can be confirmed without forcing interpretation beyond what is written. And that may feel unsatisfying at first, but only until you realize something deeper. The Bible is not unclear about what truly matters. It may not name every nation, but it speaks with precision about truth, about salvation, and about the condition of the human heart. And at the center of all of it is not a country, not a system, but a person. Jesus said in John 14 verse 6, "I am the way and the truth and the life." That is where certainty is found, not in identifying modern nations within ancient prophecy, but in knowing the one who stands outside of time and defines it, the one who does not shift with history, does not depend on interpretation, and does not leave room for confusion about what leads to life. This is why the question you started with begins to change. It is no longer, where does America fit? It becomes, where do I stand in relation to him? Because when everything else is uncertain, that answer is not. And once that becomes clear, the need for speculation fades. Not because the world stops being complex, but because your foundation is no longer built on trying to decode it. It is built on something unshakable. And that leads to one final reflection that brings everything together. When everything feels uncertain, clarity becomes more valuable than ever. Not the kind of clarity that comes from having every detail explained, but the kind that anchors you even when questions remain. The kind that does not depend on headlines, theories, or shifting interpretations. Hebrews 12 verse 28 speaks about receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. That is the perspective that changes everything, because it means your peace is not tied to understanding every event. Your stability is not built on identifying every symbol, and your faith is not sustained by trying to map the future with precision. It is sustained by what does not move. The world will continue to raise questions. New ideas will appear. Different voices will offer explanations, some convincing, some misleading. And the pressure to figure it all out will always be there. But you were never called to carry that weight. You were called to remain faithful, to stay grounded in truth, to recognize what aligns with Scripture and what does not, to live with awareness but not fear, with attention but not anxiety. Because in the end, the most important thing was never about identifying a nation in prophecy. It was about not losing sight of what has already been revealed. And when that becomes your focus, something changes. The confusion begins to settle. The urgency becomes clearer. And instead of searching for answers everywhere else, you begin to stand firmly in the one place where truth has always been.